Your central nervous system sends commands to your body through what's known as the motor division. The somatic nervous system is the branch of the motor division which gives command to skeletal muscle, while the autonomic nervous system is the branch of the motor division which gives commands to everything else: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, exocrine glands, endocrine glands, even adipose and immune cells. There are additional differences between the SNS and ANS. In the somatic nervous system, the neuron has its dendrites and soma within the central nervous system, within the brain or spinal cord. But the axon leaves the central nervous system and proceeds all the way to the effector. So it is this one single neuron which transports the message from the central nervous system to the effector and synapses with the effector. In contrast, in the autonomic nervous system, the neuron whose soma and dendrites are in the central nervous system leaves the central nervous system, its axon does, but it does not reach the effectors and synapse with them. Instead, there is a synapse with a second neuron, and it is this second neuron which then proceeds to synapse with the effector. So in the autonomic nervous system, there are two neurons. Now, where does the soma for the second neuron belong? Well, a cluster of soma in the central nervous system is referred to as a nucleus. Outside the central nervous system, it is referred to as a ganglion. You may recall that outside the spinal cord, there are dorsal root ganglia which have the soma of sensory neurons. They are called ganglia because they contain soma and are outside the central nervous system. Because the autonomic nervous system possesses these two neurons, and the synapse between them includes the soma of the second neuron outside the central nervous system. There thus is a ganglion which contains this soma, and therefore we can call these neurons the preganglionic neuron, which goes from the central nervous system to the ganglion, and the postganglionic neuron, which goes from the ganglion to synapse with the effector. There are also differences in the myelination of these axons. In the SNS, the axons are wide and myelinated, meaning that they can then transport messages very rapidly. In the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are smaller and the axons narrower. While they do have myelin, they don't have as much myelin, so they are more lightly myelinated as opposed to heavily myelinated. The postganglionic axons are unmyelinated. Finally, while acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released in the SNS, and it is always excitatory, the neurons of the ANS vary in whether they release acetylcholine or epinephrine and norepinephrine. And each of these can then vary as to how the effector tissues respond to it. So each neurotransmitter can either be excitatory or inhibitory. These are the differences between the neurons of the somatic nervous system and those of the autonomic nervous system.